Europe covers just 2% of the surface of the Earth. It's the second smallest of the continents, but it's also one of the most dynamic. The people who've lived here over the past 50,000 years have frequently fought among themselves, warring over land and ideologies. But they've also made remarkable contributions to human knowledge in fields such as art, literature, mathematics, philosophy, medicine, and science. Europeans, whether or not they would think of themselves as such, have changed the world. Tonight, we'll look at some of the key events and achievements in European history. We'll also try to get a sense of how the very concept of Europe has evolved over the centuries. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the sleepy history of Europe. Where to begin? We might start with the landmass itself. About 200 million years ago, the continent we now know as Europe was still part of the supercontinent Pangaea. Over millions of years, as tectonic plates split, Pangaea gradually began to break apart. The northern Atlantic Ocean was formed, and, much later, further tectonic movement led to the creation of European mountain ranges such as the Alps and the Pyrenees. By around 5 million years ago, Europe, as we know it, had more or less taken shape. Now, as you can probably imagine, we have a lot to get through. So let's fast forward to the first humans. Early human species lived in Europe about 1.8 million years ago, most likely having arrived from Africa. The first anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, seem to have appeared in Europe around 50,000 years ago. A variety of cultures began to develop across the continent, and archaeological findings give us some insight into how they lived. Tools, for instance, gradually became more sophisticated. Burial sites also provide evidence of rituals and beliefs, a sense of group identity. At some point, people began to create art. A famous example is the Venus of Willendorf, a limestone figurine of a woman that was made about 30,000 years ago in what is now Austria. These archaeological discoveries show us that across the continent, unique cultures and civilizations were starting to evolve. There was more to life than mere survival. But according to many historians, the first major civilization didn't appear until much later, during the Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE. The Minoan civilization was based on the island of Crete, now part of Greece, and it flourished for about 2,000 years. The Minoans were skilled artists and craftsmen, and they built grand palaces such as Knossos, the ruins of which can still be visited today. They also traded extensively with people in neighboring lands such as Egypt and Syria. The Minoan civilization gradually declined, but from around 1750 BCE, another important culture emerged nearby on mainland Greece. The Mycenaeans were similarly sophisticated, with their impressive architecture and engineering. So, we can see that in early European history, Greece stands out as a hub of civilization. And this brings us to a disclaimer of sorts. In this story, to keep things simple, we'll mainly be focusing on Western and Southern Europe. It was in this region that some of the most important cultural movements emerged, movements that defined the development of Western civilization. Though, of course, that's not to say that the rest of Europe was some sort of cultural backwater. At around the time that the Mycenaeans were in Greece, many other cultures were thriving elsewhere. For example, the Mycenaeans traded goods with Bronze Age Nordic societies who lived in parts of northern Germany and southern Scandinavia. Some of these people were skilled metalworkers, crafting beautiful bronze tools, jewelry, and weapons. In Sweden, they also left behind intriguing hints of their daily lives and religious beliefs through hundreds of rock carvings. Many of these carvings depict ships, a predictable choice of subject given how important they were for a seafaring community. Elsewhere in Europe, it was horses that were essential. From around the 6th to the 3rd centuries BCE, the Scythians lived on the Pontic steppe, an area that stretches across Eastern Europe and into Central Asia. As a nomadic population, the Scythians became expert horsemen. They developed advanced saddles and were famous for their skills in mounted archery. Over the centuries, Scythian tribes dominated the region. The area around Crimea, now part of Ukraine, became one of their most important power bases. There's so much more we could say about the Scythians, not to mention the many other cultures living in Europe at the time. The Thracians, for instance, in modern-day Bulgaria, or the Celtic Iron Age culture known as Latin, which was active in much of Western and Central Europe. But now, it's time to return to the place where things were really taking off: Greece. Ancient Greek civilization was one of the most influential in history, leaving an unparalleled legacy. The period that historians refer to as classical antiquity began around the 8th century BCE. This was the time, more or less, that the epic poetry of Homer was being composed, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Ancient Greek civilization reached its peak in Athens from the 5th century BCE and ended around the 2nd century BCE, about the time that the Roman Republic became a major power. During this period, Greeks such as Euclid were making important discoveries in geometry and laying the foundations of modern mathematics. Philosophers including Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were asking the big questions. Others were developing the fields of astronomy and medicine. To this day, many doctors still swear a version of the Hippocratic Oath, an oath of ethics that originates in an ancient Greek text. Then there was the art, architecture, theatre, the foundation of the Olympic Games, the world's first known democracy. The list goes on. There's a reason why Greece, and Athens in particular, is considered the birthplace of Western civilization. This brings us to an interesting question. Why here? As we've seen, there was plenty going on in other parts of Europe. Why did Greece in particular produce so many remarkable people? We mentioned earlier civilizations in the area, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. The ancient Greeks would have taken inspiration from these cultures. In terms of academic knowledge, they were also influenced by other civilizations such as the Babylonians and Egyptians. The conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE helped to facilitate cultural exchanges between different regions. But there was also something special about Athens in particular. For example, some people in ancient Athens, a privileged minority, had an abundance of leisure time. They also lived in a society where knowledge and public debate were highly valued. This made it easier to share ideas and helped people to build on each other's work. If a genius like Socrates had been born in the same period, but in another part of Europe, he may not have become a famous philosopher. Many different factors have to converge to create people like Socrates, and a civilization as important and influential as that of classical Greece. Another noteworthy Greek innovation is the name Europe itself. This may be a reference to Europa, a princess in Greek mythology. Alternatively, the name might be a combination of two Greek words, meaning something along the lines of wide gazing. To Greek sailors, the continent's shoreline may have struck them as being broad. Interestingly, even though we now consider Greece part of Europe, to many early Greeks, Europe was something separate. It was the land to the north, a relatively uncivilized place. In the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, the peoples inhabiting the cold places and those of Europe are full of spirit, but inferior with regard to intelligence and skill. They continue to be comparatively free, but lack civic organization and the ability to rule their neighbors. After the Greeks came the Romans, the next big civilization to dominate Western Europe. At its peak, under the Emperor Trajan in the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire covered nearly 2 million square miles. It stretched across swathes of southern and western Europe, as well as parts of Africa and the Middle East. While the empire would eventually fall, it left a lasting legacy. Roman achievements include advances in plumbing and sanitation, as well as the foundation of major European cities such as London and Vienna. Additionally, Roman law became the foundation for modern legal systems worldwide. And, let's not forget, the Romans helped to transmit and preserve Greek learning. The Romans greatly admired the Greeks. They sought to imitate them in their religion, in their art and architecture, and many other areas. To some extent, it's thanks to the Romans that Greek advances in learning, in everything from geometry to astronomy, survived to be passed on to the next generations. We also have the Romans to thank for another big development, one that would have an unprecedented impact on Europe. In the Middle East, a new religion had formed, followers of Jesus Christ, who called themselves Christians. From the 1st century CE, there were a small number of Christians living in Rome, most likely converts from the Jewish community. However, they remained a minority, one that was sometimes persecuted, until the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and legalized the religion. Later, under Theodosius I, Christianity became the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This is one of the main factors that allowed the faith to spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Christianity became popular for many reasons. It promised salvation and offered community. And, unlike Judaism, anyone could become a Christian. Christianity was enthusiastically promoted by missionaries who traveled along the extensive road network of the Roman Empire. Over the following years, and in multiple stages, the faith would continue to spread across Europe. By the end of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had fallen. For most historians, this marked the beginning of the Middle Ages. The Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, would survive for another 1,000 years. We'll come back to that later. In Western Europe, the early Middle Ages have also been known as the Dark Ages. This term, now seen as outdated, was first used by the Italian scholar Petrarch in the 14th century. To Petrarch, the early Middle Ages seemed dark when compared to the radiance of classical antiquity. It seemed like a time of cultural decline. It's true that once great cities like Athens and Rome were shadows of their former selves. Much of Western Europe had been taken over by Germanic kingdoms. These rulers controlled large areas of territory, but to some extent they were less sophisticated than Roman leaders. The Roman Empire had benefited from resources and bureaucracy, large-scale organization. A bit later on in the Middle Ages, power became more localized, and the feudal system emerged. It became the dominant political structure in parts of Europe, a rigid hierarchy based on land ownership, which made social mobility virtually impossible. People were very dependent on the tier above them, and serfs were the worst off. These peasant farmers were tied to the land they worked on, and often exploited by their lords. At this point, it's worth taking a moment to pause and reflect. Throughout European history, the vast majority of the population have been peasants, rural labourers. They worked the land, providing food not just for themselves, but the rest of society. While we tend to focus on the famous figures, monarchs, religious leaders, and so on, let's remember that their lives and achievements were made possible by the labour of ordinary people. Without them, there would have been no Roman Empire, no Renaissance. But before we get to the Renaissance, let's look at some other things that were going on during the Middle Ages. As we've mentioned, the medieval era has sometimes been viewed negatively and unfairly as a somewhat stagnant or even backward time. However, things certainly began to pick up as the years went on. For instance, while the glory days of Rome were over, the Republic of Venice rose in power and influence as a major trading centre. Meanwhile, Paris became one of the largest cities in Europe. By 1300, it had a population of about 200,000. Many towns and cities in Europe developed rich cultures and became centres of learning. Monasteries, in particular, were intellectual hubs, which brings us to another point: the role of the Church and the unstoppable rise of Christianity. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Christianity not only survived, but flourished. It spread across Europe, becoming the dominant religion and influencing all aspects of society, from politics to education. Christian scholars copied and translated classic texts from ancient Greece and Rome, helping to preserve them. These scholars often incorporated their own faith-based commentary, but the original texts and ideas survived. Another survivor was Latin, the language of the Romans. In the Middle Ages, it became the primary language of education, administration, and the Church. During these years, many important shifts in power and culture were taking place across Europe. England stands out as a particularly interesting example. After being ruled by the Romans, there was a period of Germanic immigration. These settlers became known as the Anglo-Saxons, and a rich culture developed. A number of powerful kingdoms were established across the country, and by the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity. Over the following centuries, there was more migration from Scandinavia, plus a series of Viking invasions and a rather turbulent political situation. In 1066, England was invaded on a large scale for the final time by the Normans. After the initial upheaval, things stabilized to a certain extent, allowing England to develop a distinctive identity. From relatively early on, England had a strong, centralized monarchy. But while the monarch was powerful, he didn't have absolute power. In 1215, the King of England signed a document known as Magna Carta. This stated that no one was above the law, not even the king, and that people had a right to a fair trial. For the early 13th century, this was pretty revolutionary stuff. While there's a lot more we could say about English history, for now, we'll leave you with this observation. As an island nation with a relatively consistent governance, at least compared to some other countries in Europe, England became somewhat unique. It began to develop a national identity early on, having been a unified state since the 10th century. Germany and Italy, on the other hand, didn't become unified countries until the 19th century. In part, perhaps these differences explain why today Britain is seen as both European and a nation slightly apart. Elsewhere in Europe in the Middle Ages, power was fragmented among many different rulers: kings, emperors, lords, and dukes. Some of these rulers became exceptionally powerful, such as Charlemagne, a Frankish king who ruled in the 8th century. But by the High Middle Ages, around the 11th and 12th centuries, one of the most influential powers in Europe was the papacy. It's remarkable to reflect on this transformation when we remember how the early Christians were a minority group. By the 11th century, Christianity was the main religion, and the Pope was one of the most powerful men in all of Europe. Although the papacy didn't have its own permanent army, it was able to recruit plenty of soldiers from across Europe in times of need. This explains how, between 1095 and 1291, the papacy was able to initiate a series of military campaigns known as the Crusades. The idea was for Christian soldiers to reclaim the Holy Land, including the city of Jerusalem, which was under Muslim rule. While the First Crusade was a success, subsequent wars didn't go too well. But the Crusaders certainly persevered, launching multiple campaigns over a period of 200 years. This tells us something not just about the power of the papacy, but the level of Christian fervor in Europe. People were prepared to die for their beliefs. That being said, some crusaders were likely motivated by less spiritual motives, such as desire for wealth or glory. Wanderlust may have also been a factor. Back then, joining an army was a way to see the world. Between the 8th and 15th centuries, there was conflict between Christians and Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula. From the 8th century onwards, much of Spain and Portugal was under Muslim rule. This territory was occupied by the Moors, who were based in North Africa. Over the following centuries, there were consistent efforts by Christian armies to retake the territory. These military campaigns became known as the Reconquista or Reconquest. In 1492, the city of Granada was recaptured, ending Muslim rule in this part of Europe. Although religion wasn't the only factor, the success of the Reconquista demonstrates just how important and how powerful Christianity had become in Europe. Ever since the earliest days of European history, wars have been fought. People were constantly fighting over land and power. What's interesting about the Middle Ages is that from this point on, religious motivations became prominent in certain conflicts. This may seem strange to us today, given that Christianity is often associated with peace. But in medieval times, many Christians believed that violence could be justified or even required to defend their faith. In 1095, Pope Urban II suggested that war could be holy. Fighting could even have spiritual benefits. For some, there was no contradiction in being a follower of Christ, a man who preached peace and tolerance while also taking part in wars and other violent acts. In the Middle Ages, Christianity helped to shape European identity. People living in otherwise very different cultures, for example, Spain and Germany, were to some extent united by their shared faith. For many, Europe meant Christendom. However, the average person living in France during the Middle Ages would have identified much more strongly with their town or region. They wouldn't have thought of themselves as being European. At this point in history, even national identity, the idea of being French, for instance, was secondary to regional ties. We've mainly been focusing on Western Europe, but now it's time to take a quick look to the East. As we mentioned earlier, the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, survived throughout the Middle Ages. For hundreds of years, it was the major power in Greece and the Balkans. Its capital was Constantinople, now Istanbul in Turkey. In 1453, in a dramatic turn of events, this city was captured by the Ottoman Turks. The fall of Constantinople marks not just the end of the Byzantine Empire, but also, for many historians, the end of the Middle Ages. Across Europe, change was on the horizon. The fall of Constantinople had a huge, wide-reaching impact. But in the short term, one of the most interesting consequences was the exodus of scholars. When Constantinople was taken over by the Turks, Byzantine scholars fled the city. Many moved to Italy, bringing their manuscripts with them. These scholars would contribute to the cultural movement that was already underway in Italy, the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. From the 14th to the 16th century, people in Western Europe were rediscovering classical antiquity and creating their own works in response. As a cultural movement, the Renaissance looked backwards to the glory of ancient Greece and Rome. But it also broke new ground in art, architecture, literature, philosophy, politics, science, and exploration. One of the most iconic artworks of the Renaissance is The School of Athens by the Italian artist Raphael. This magnificent fresco shows the great philosophers of the past surrounded by grand architecture. For Raphael and other Renaissance figures, the ancient Greeks were as relevant as ever. While Christianity remained important throughout Europe, the Renaissance saw a shift through the development of humanism. People became increasingly interested in man's capabilities. For instance, take another Renaissance artwork, The Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. This drawing of a naked man represents a growing interest in anatomy and science, and the belief that the individual human was worthy of study. Although the Renaissance spread across Europe, it began in Italy, and Florence is often seen as the movement's birthplace. Why here in particular? Well, as always, there are many factors. Wealth from trade, for instance, and rich patrons of the arts, like the Medici. In addition, we might draw a comparison to Athens in the 5th century BCE. In 15th century Florence, a lot of talented, knowledgeable people were active in the city at around the same time, taking inspiration from one another. And let's keep in mind that at the time, Italy wasn't a unified country. It was made up of lots of different states, a bit like ancient Greece. This may have been a contributing factor in terms of Italy's cultural development. It led to more diversity and rivalry between states, the perfect conditions for progress. Renaissance curiosity and ambition also contributed to the Age of Discovery, or Age of Exploration, which began in the late 15th century. Many Europeans took to the seas, most notably Christopher Columbus. This Italian explorer led Spanish expeditions across the Atlantic Ocean. for the first time in recorded history, Europeans made sustained contact with the Americas. However, as a side note, it seems that the Vikings technically got there first, reaching North America in the 11th century. From the late 15th century onwards, people from Spain, Portugal, England, the Netherlands, and other European countries travelled around the world, trading and establishing colonies. These journeys led to cultural exchanges, technological advancements, and economic growth. But they also had a devastating impact on indigenous populations. To give just a few examples, Europeans brought smallpox to the Americas, wiping out much of the population. They also took over land by force, displacing and sometimes killing the natives and destroying local cultures. The Age of Discovery had a mixed legacy, to say the least. A recurring theme in history, and not just European history, is that progress often comes at the expense of more vulnerable people. Now, as if there wasn't enough going on, we also have the Reformation, which began in Germany in the early 16th century. Reformation refers to the attempt to reform the Catholic Church. Theologians such as Martin Luther were very critical of the Church and certain Catholic practices. They believed one could be a good Christian simply through having faith in Christ and following the teachings of the Bible. The Reformation led to the emergence of Protestantism and paved the way for further divisions in Christianity. Many believed that reform was much needed, given the state of the Catholic Church at the time. In many ways, the Reformation was revolutionary, challenging traditional authority and changing the relationship that people had with their faith. And, as with any kind of revolution, the Reformation also created a huge amount of conflict. For centuries to come, the relationship between Catholics and Protestants in Europe would often be a hostile one. We've seen how a concept of Europe has gradually been developing based on a shared faith. Despite the divisions we've just mentioned, Christianity remained a major cultural force and a symbol of identity. Many people saw a clear distinction between Christian Europe and other civilizations. The Ottoman Turks, who now ruled Constantinople, for instance, or the indigenous people of the Americas. Interestingly, it was around the 16th century that Europe became more precisely defined as a distinct geographical entity. Advances in cartography, map-making, led to the creation of more accurate maps. In 1570, the Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius created a detailed map of Europe, which is remarkably similar to modern-day versions. Now, at the time, maps would have been luxury items. The average person in Europe didn't have an atlas in their home, and their knowledge of European geography would have been quite limited. Nonetheless, the existence of these kinds of maps shows how Europe was becoming more clearly conceptualized. Seemingly distant and disparate regions, such as Spain and the Baltic lands, were recognized as belonging to the same larger entity. The Renaissance led to major shifts in Europe, progress and revolutions across multiple fields, as people began to re-examine society, man's place in the world, and their relationship with religion. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries saw significant development in mathematics and many scientific fields. Thanks to geniuses like Copernicus from Poland, Galileo from Italy, and Isaac Newton from England, people gained a new understanding of the world. After the scientific revolution came the Age of Enlightenment, which emerged in the late 17th century. Once again, though it spread across the continent, it was centered in Western Europe. Enlightenment thinkers were inspired by science and a rational approach. They questioned traditions and conventions, in some cases advocating for separation between church and state. An important Enlightenment principle was that of individual liberty. Over the years, there was a gradual push for freedom, as many began to challenge religious authority. Enlightenment thinkers believed that people were capable of extraordinary things. Given the recent successes in so many fields, it's little wonder. One of the most dramatic consequences of Enlightenment philosophy took place in France in the late 18th century. When we consider the French Revolution, we can see that many of the ingredients came from the Enlightenment. Principles of individual liberty and ideas of social, political, and religious reform. That being said, the causes of the revolution were complex. A financial crisis, widespread hunger and discontent, and resentment of the monarchy also fanned the flames. The French Revolution lasted for a decade and sent shockwaves through Europe. It was an attack on the monarchy, the church, and anyone who was perceived to be an enemy of the revolution. In France, thousands of people went to the guillotine, which gained the nickname the National Razor. Societal change came at an enormous cost, but to some extent, the revolutionaries achieved their aims. The French Revolution impacted not just France and not just Europe, but the world. According to many historians, the revolution had a significant influence on both modern democracy and nationalism. Meanwhile, across the Channel, another kind of revolution was fermenting. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain sometime in the 18th century, as early as 1730 or as late as 1780. Historians' opinions differ. At any rate, by the 19th century, industrialization was well underway. There were major technological advances in areas such as manufacturing and the railway, and the British economy was booming. The reasons why the Industrial Revolution took off in Britain rather than elsewhere in Europe are many and complex. One contributing factor was Britain's abundant supply of natural resources such as coal and iron. There was also a strong economy, an efficient agricultural system which allowed more people to work in industry, and a culture of innovation. Over the course of about a century, industrialization transformed Britain. Rapid urbanization had numerous consequences, including the seemingly unstoppable growth of London. By the end of the 19th century, more than 6.5 million people lived in the capital. London was the largest city not just in Europe, but the world. The Industrial Revolution also led to the expansion of the railway network, first in Britain and then Belgium and other parts of Europe. As countries and the continent became better connected, people in Europe could take advantage of new opportunities, from trade to tourism. Not all the consequences of the Industrial Revolution were positive. Predictably, pollution increased, as did social inequality in some parts of Europe. Still, there's no denying the transformative effect of industrialization. In the 19th century, Western Europe underwent some of the fastest and most dramatic changes in its history. Additionally, as a result of many different factors, including improved access to food and advances in medicine, the population of Europe doubled. It was now home to around 400 million people. In 1914, Europe was plunged into war. The trigger was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But there's no simple explanation for the causes of the First World War. The growth of nationalism, imperialism, militarism, tension over alliances, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, and the changing balance of power in Europe. These are just some of the factors that contributed to the outbreak of war. The conflict is known as the First World War because it went far beyond Europe. On one side were the Allied powers, including European countries such as France and the United Kingdom, but also the United States and Japan. On the other side were the Central Powers, including Germany and Austria-Hungary. The First World War ended with a victory for the Allied powers 4 years later, in 1918. It's estimated that in total, more than 20 million people lost their lives. The First World War had a devastating impact on many countries, including Germany. In the aftermath, according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to accept full responsibility for the damage caused by the war. In addition, they lost territory, were forced to downsize their military, and ordered to pay reparations, a sum equivalent to around $32 billion. Even outside of Germany, many believed these penalties to be too extreme. Ironically, although the aim was to prevent such a terrible conflict from ever happening again, this punishment had an unintended consequence. It contributed to the conditions that allowed the Nazis to rise to power. Many people in Germany saw Adolf Hitler as a strong, inspiring leader who would rescue their country. In 1939, Germany, now led by Hitler, invaded Poland. This was the beginning of the Second World War, another major conflict that would drag on for 6 years. Once again, it involved countries from around the globe. The Allies, including the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union, fought against the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. This list of participants shows just how much the world had changed by the 20th century. Everything had become so complex and interconnected that a move by one country, Germany invading Poland, could trigger a global conflict. The Allies won in 1945, but the impact of the war would last for decades to come. The Second World War was the deadliest conflict in history. as many as 60 million people died, and the majority were civilians. In the aftermath of the war, there was much discussion about how to prevent anything like it from ever happening again, how to make Europe more united. The Council of Europe was founded in 1949 with the aims of promoting democracy and protecting human rights. In 1958, the body that later became the European Parliament convened for the first time in Strasbourg, France. And in 1993, following many years of discussions, negotiations, and treaties, the European Union was established. The European Union, or EU, currently unites 27 member states. Other European countries, such as Albania and Serbia, may join in the future, while the United Kingdom, ever the outsider, voted to leave in 2016. Of course, it would be an oversimplification to say that the EU defines Europe, especially as not all European countries are members. Nonetheless, by uniting so much of the continent, both politically and economically, it's a powerful symbol. And while the EU is a relatively recent creation, it owes its existence to centuries of history and philosophical thought. In particular, the values of the Enlightenment. The Treaty of Lisbon became effective in 2009 and currently provides the legal basis for the EU. In the preamble, it refers to the cultural, religious, and humanist inheritance of Europe, from which have developed the universal values of the inviolable and inalienable rights of the human person: freedom, democracy, equality, and the rule of law. We might also note the EU's motto, United in Diversity. Despite these efforts, divisions still exist in Europe. And sadly for some Europeans, war is not just history, but a daily reality. Still, reflecting on Europe's extraordinary past, it seems that there's reason to be optimistic. It might be argued that these days, on the whole, Europe is more united, peaceful, and prosperous than at any other time in history. Over thousands of years, the continent has seen the rise and fall of great powers, the birth of new ideas and technologies, and the gradual evolution of a European identity. Whatever comes next, it's bound to be fascinating and unpredictable, just like the continent itself.